They thought she was just another girl on the road. Police officers humiliated and mistreated Malia Obama, pushing her to the limit. But everything changed the moment her father, former President Barack Obama, arrived. What happened next stunned everyone. Subscribe and write in the comments from where you're watching us. The California sun hung low in the late afternoon sky, casting long golden rays over the endless stretch of asphalt ahead. Malia Obama gripped the steering wheel of the rented SUV with one hand, her other resting lightly on the armrest as the car hummed along the deserted highway. The road was smooth, flanked by rolling hills that faded into the horizon, their outlines blurred by the heat shimmering off the ground. Sparse clusters of scrubby trees and dry brush broke the monotony of the landscape, but otherwise the scene was stark and empty, a vast expanse of solitude. Malia welcomed the quiet. After days of speeches, interviews, and panels at the Youth Equality Summit in San Francisco, the silence was a balm. She had poured her heart into her presentation, hoping to inspire other young leaders to challenge systemic injustices. The applause and praise afterward had been gratifying, but the real reward came in the form of a dozen young people who had approached her afterward, their eyes alight with determination as they shared their own stories of perseverance. Her phone, resting in the cup holder beside her, buzzed with notifications, texts from friends, emails from organizers, and alerts from the news. But for now, she ignored it. She had made a conscious decision to disconnect for this drive. Just her, the open road, and the sense of freedom that came with it. Adjusting her sunglasses, she glanced at the dashboard clock. It was just after 6:30 p.m., and she still had a few hours ahead before reaching Los Angeles. Her playlist shifted to a mellow acoustic track, and she let the music wash over her, her mind drifting. For the first time in weeks, she felt calm. No schedules to follow, no cameras to face, no reporters dissecting her every word, just her thoughts and the road. But even as she relaxed, the weight of her last name lingered in the back of her mind. Being an Obama meant walking a tightrope. On one hand, it opened doors, opportunities that most people her age could only dream of, but on the other, it carried expectations that sometimes felt suffocating. She had spent years trying to step out of her father's shadow, to prove that she was more than just the president's daughter. At the summit, she had spoken passionately about breaking free from labels, about carving out her own identity. Yet, even as the words left her lips, she couldn't ignore the murmurs that followed her everywhere she went. People rarely saw her for who she was. They saw her father's legacy first and foremost. She had learned to handle it, to keep her composure no matter what. Her father's advice echoed in her head. Stay calm, stay focused, and never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden flash of blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. Malia's heart skipped a beat. She instinctively checked her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Her seatbelt was fastened. The car was in perfect condition. So why were they pulling her over? She eased off the gas and signaled to pull onto the dusty shoulder, her pulse quickening. She parked, took a steadying breath, and reached for her license and registration, which she had prepared earlier. Her father's voice rang in her ears again. Be polite, but don't let them push you around. And if something doesn't feel right, call me immediately. She checked the mirror as two officers stepped out of the patrol car behind her. Both were white, both wearing dark sunglasses, and both carried an air of authority that felt suffocating even before they approached. Malia swallowed hard and rolled down her window, her fingers tightening around her ID. "Good evening, officers," she said, keeping her tone calm and neutral. "Is there a problem?" The taller of the two, a broad-shouldered man with close-cropped blonde hair, stopped beside her window, his hand resting near his holstered gun. "License and registration," he said, ignoring her question. Malia handed over the documents, her stomach twisting as the officer's gaze lingered on her face. "This your car?" he asked, flipping through the papers without looking up. "Yes," she replied. "It's a rental." He glanced at her again, this time with a flicker of something she couldn't quite read. Doubt, maybe, or suspicion. "Where are you headed?" "Los Angeles." The officer exchanged a look with his partner, a shorter man with a buzz cut who stood slightly behind him, arms crossed. "Step out of the vehicle," the taller officer said. Malia blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said, step out of the vehicle." Her grip on the steering wheel tightened. She wanted to ask why, to demand an explanation, but she knew better. Arguing would only escalate the situation. Suppressing the tremor in her hands, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. The officers stepped back, watching her closely as she climbed out. The dry, hot air hit her like a wave, but it was nothing compared to the heat radiating from their stares. "Face the car," the taller officer said. Malia hesitated, her heart pounding, but did as she was told. She could feel their eyes on her as they began questioning her again, where she was coming from, what she was doing in the area, why she was driving alone. Each question was laced with insinuations, as though her very presence on this road was an anomaly. One of the officers took her ID and held it up, squinting at it. "Obama?" he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "You expect me to believe that?" Malia turned to face him, struggling to keep her voice steady. "It's my name," she said. "I can show you additional identification if you need it." The officer smirked. "We'll see about that." He gestured for his partner to search the car. Malia's stomach twisted as she watched the other officer rummage through her belongings, pulling out her laptop, books, and papers. "Fancy stuff," he said, holding up her laptop. "What do you do for a living?" Malia clenched her fists. "I'm a student." The officer snorted. "Sure you are." She bit her tongue, willing herself to stay calm, but panic was bubbling just beneath the surface. This wasn't a routine stop. This was something else, something darker. As the minutes dragged on, the humiliation mounted. She thought about her father, about everything he had taught her about resilience and strength. But standing there, under the harsh scrutiny of these men, she felt small and powerless. Her phone was still in the car, out of reach. She needed to call her father. She needed help. The taller officer stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "Looks like we're going to need to take you in for further questioning," he said. Malia's breath caught. "Wait," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I need to make a phone call." The officer hesitated, then nodded. One call. As she climbed back into the car to grab her phone, her hands trembled. She dialed her father's number, silently praying he would pick up. When his voice came through the line, steady and calm as always, the dam inside her broke. "Dad," she said, her voice shaking. "I need you." The setting sun cast long shadows over the empty stretch of highway, but the flashing red and blue lights behind Malia Obama's car pierced through the fading daylight. She felt the thrum of her heartbeat quicken as the police cruiser idled a few feet away, its presence heavy and oppressive. The gravel under her feet shifted slightly as she stepped out of the car, her movements slow and deliberate, her hands held visibly at her sides. She had learned that much from her parents. Make no sudden moves, stay calm, and comply. But even as she tried to steady her breathing, dread coiled tightly in her stomach. The taller of the two officers, whose broad shoulders and mirrored sunglasses gave him an intimidating air, gestured for her to step away from the vehicle. His partner, shorter and stockier, lingered near the patrol car, arms crossed and eyes sharp, like a predator waiting for the right moment to pounce. "Move to the front of the car," the taller officer barked. Malia obeyed, walking toward the SUV's hood, her steps measured. She tried not to let her hands shake as she braced them lightly on the warm metal. "Name?" the officer demanded, flipping open a notepad. "Malia Obama." The name hung in the air, but the officer's pen paused only briefly before he resumed writing. "License and registration." "They're in my purse," she replied, motioning to the passenger seat. The officer raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Get them." Slowly. Malia moved carefully, retrieving the documents and holding them out to him. He snatched them from her hand, his eyes narrowing as he studied the license. His gaze flicked back to her face, assessing, doubting. "This your car?" "It's a rental." "Where are you coming from?" "San Francisco. I spoke at a conference." The words tasted bitter as she said them, the explanation already feeling pointless. "A conference?" he repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "For what?" "Equality and racial justice," Malia replied, her voice steady despite the tension thrumming under her skin. The shorter officer chuckled under his breath, and the taller one smirked. "That so?" the taller one said, lowering her ID. "You expect me to believe that?" Malia stiffened. She had spent her entire life navigating situations where people underestimated her because of her age, gender, or the color of her skin. But this felt different. This wasn't just disbelief, it was accusation. "I'm telling the truth," she said, lifting her chin slightly. The officer's smirk deepened. "We'll see about that." He turned to his partner. "Search the car." The words hit her like a slap. "What? No," she protested. "You don't have—" "We have probable cause," the taller officer interrupted. "Step back." Malia froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. She knew the law well enough to question their claim, but she also knew that arguing would only escalate the situation. With a deep breath, she stepped away from the car and watched helplessly as the shorter officer began rifling through her belongings. Her neatly packed suitcase was unzipped, her clothes tossed aside without care. The officer pulled out her laptop, holding it up with a smirk. "Pretty fancy," he said, opening it and tapping the keyboard. "What's on here? Plans for another protest?" "It's for work," Malia said, her voice tight. "Work," he repeated mockingly. "What kind of work?" Malia swallowed hard. "I'm a student." "Sure you are." The humiliation burned in her chest. She had done everything right. She was respectful, cooperative, calm. And still, it wasn't enough. The officer turned back to her. "Stand still." Before she could respond, the taller officer grabbed her by the arm and led her a few steps farther from the car. "You got any weapons?" he asked, his grip firm. "No." "Drugs?" "No." He patted her down anyway, his hands lingering just long enough to make her feel exposed. "Nothing here," he said, stepping back as if disappointed. Malia clenched her fists, fighting back tears of frustration. She wanted to scream, to demand they stop treating her like a criminal. But instead, she forced herself to stand tall. "You can't do this," she said, her voice trembling despite her resolve. The taller officer leaned in closer. "We can do whatever we need to," he said quietly, his words laced with menace. Malia felt her stomach drop. She had read stories about situations like this, and she knew how quickly they could spiral out of control. She needed help, Now. "Can I make a call?" she asked, her voice cracking. The taller officer studied her for a moment, then shrugged. One call. Malia reached for her phone, her fingers shaking as she scrolled through her contacts. She pressed her father's name and waited, the ringing echoing in her ears. When his voice came through the line, calm, steady, and familiar, tears pricked her eyes. "Dad," she whispered, struggling to keep her composure, "I need you." "What happened?" "I'm pulled over. They're searching my car. They don't believe me." "Stay where you are," he said immediately, his voice sharp with focus. "Don't argue. Don't move. I'm coming." The call ended, and Malia's grip on the phone tightened. She turned to face the officers again, her resolve hardening. "My father is on his way," she said, meeting the taller officer's eyes. He raised an eyebrow, then smirked. "Oh, is he?" The shorter officer laughed. "Let me guess. Daddy's gonna come save the day?" They laughed, but Malia didn't flinch. Instead, she squared her shoulders, her pulse slowing as her father's words echoed in her mind. "Never let them make you feel like you don't belong." She would stand her ground. As the patrol car's radio crackled to life, signaling another call, the taller officer ignored it, keeping his eyes fixed on Malia. "Let's see what your daddy has to say about this." The words dripped with mockery, but Malia didn't respond. She simply stood there, clutching her phone and waiting. Because she knew what was coming. And so did they. Malia Obama stood by the side of her car, the gravel shifting slightly beneath her shoes as the last traces of daylight vanished behind the hills. The red and blue lights from the patrol car still flashed, casting harsh shadows that danced across the asphalt. She tightened her grip on her phone, the echo of her father's voice still lingering in her ears. "Stay where you are. I'm coming." But even those reassuring words couldn't ease the tightness in her chest or the nausea creeping up from her stomach. She had done everything right. She had been polite, compliant, and calm, yet here she was, treated like a criminal under the setting sun. The taller officer stepped closer again, his shadow stretching across the hood of her car. "So, little princess called for backup, huh?" he said, his voice low but sharp. Malia refused to respond, knowing any answer could be twisted against her. Instead, she stared straight ahead, willing herself not to let the heat rising behind her eyes spill over. "Bet Daddy's got someone on the way to clean this up for you," he continued, circling her like a predator. "But until he gets here, you're still on my road." His partner reappeared, carrying her open suitcase as if it were evidence in a high-profile case. Clothes spilled out from the edges, neatly folded outfits now crumpled and exposed. Her toiletries bag dangled loosely from his hand, unzipped, its contents barely held together. "Didn't find anything suspicious," the shorter officer said, his tone mocking, "unless you count overpriced makeup and fancy shoes." The taller officer smirked. "Yeah? Sounds about right. Privileged girl with expensive taste and no real job." Malia felt her jaw tighten. Her silence only seemed to fuel them further. "You know," the shorter officer added, stepping closer, "we get girls like you out here sometimes. Think they're too good for the rules. Think their money or their name can get them out of trouble. That's not—" "Shut up," the taller officer snapped, cutting her off. Her breath caught in her throat. "You don't talk unless I say you can talk. You don't move unless I say you can move. Got it?" She nodded, too afraid that her voice might crack if she spoke. The shorter officer leaned against the hood of her car, setting her suitcase down roughly and letting a few more items tumble out onto the ground. "Funny, isn't it?" he said, glancing at his partner. They all say the same thing. I didn't do anything wrong. Yeah, the taller officer replied, smirking, and then they act all surprised when we find out they're hiding something. Malia's voice broke through, sharper than she intended. I'm not hiding anything. The taller officer's expression darkened instantly, and before she could take another breath, he was in front of her, towering over her. You think I care who you are? He hissed. You think your name means something to me? Out here, your name doesn't mean jack. He grabbed her arm and turned her around, pressing her against the hood of the car. Let me go, she protested, panic surging as his hand pressed down between her shoulder blades. You're resisting now? He barked, tightening his grip. No. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to keep speaking. I'm not resisting. I just want to know why you're doing this. His weight shifted off her and she straightened, turning to face him again. You don't ask questions, he snapped, pointing a finger inches from her face. You answer them. That's how this works. Malia's chest heaved. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to fight back, to demand respect, to remind them who she was and what her family represented. But the fear was stronger. Her father's words echoed in her head again. Stay calm. Stay in control. She swallowed her rage and straightened her shoulders. You've searched my car, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. You've checked my license. I've complied with everything you asked. Why are you still detaining me? The taller officer stepped closer, his mouth curling into a sneer. Because I don't trust you, he said simply. Malia stared at him, stunned. He leaned in, his voice low. Girls like you think the rules don't apply to you, but out here, they do. And you're not leaving until I'm damn sure you're not trouble. Before she could respond, the shorter officer interrupted. Hey, check this out, he said, holding up one of her books. What's this about? Revolution? Protests? Malia's stomach dropped. It was a research journal from the conference, filled with articles about activism, inequality, and systemic reform. Looks like we got ourselves a little radical, the shorter officer said, tossing the book onto the hood. The taller officer laughed. That's so? Planning to burn down any buildings tonight, Miss Obama? No, Malia said firmly. It's research. It's academic. Sure it is. The taller officer stepped closer, his face inches from hers. Tell me something, he said. What's it like, growing up in the White House, thinking you're better than everyone else? I never thought that. Then why do you look at me like you do? Malia blinked. I'm not. Like you're scared of me. His words hung in the air. She was scared of him, and he knew it. The shorter officer interrupted again. Maybe we should take her in. Let her explain herself downtown. Malia's pulse quickened. No, she said, her voice cracking. You can't. The taller officer smirked. Watch us. But before he could take another step, the distant roar of engines broke through the night air. Malia turned her head toward the sound, her breath catching as headlights appeared over the horizon. 3 black SUVs speeding down the road, their engines growling like thunder. The officers froze, their postures stiffening. What the hell is this? The shorter officer muttered. Malia didn't answer, because she knew exactly what it was. Her father had arrived, and everything was about to change. Malia's breath hitched as the headlights of the black SUVs sliced through the twilight, their imposing silhouettes growing larger with every passing second. The tension that had been building between her and the officers cracked, replaced by an almost tangible sense of panic emanating from the two men. The taller officer stepped back from her, his hand instinctively shifting toward his holster before he seemed to think better of it. His partner muttered something under his breath, barely audible over the rumble of engines. Malia's chest tightened as relief threatened to break through her controlled exterior, but she didn't allow herself to exhale just yet. Not until the vehicles stopped. Not until the doors opened. Not until her father stepped out. Her phone buzzed in her trembling hand. She glanced down at the screen. Her father's name. "Dad?" Her voice cracked despite her efforts to sound composed. "Malia." Barack Obama's voice came through steady, commanding, but edged with concern. "I'm almost there. Stay where you are and keep calm. What's happening right now?" They searched my car," she stammered, struggling to keep her voice level as the reality of what had happened finally started to sink in. "They went through my things, treated me like a criminal, and then they—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Her father's voice sharpened, though it never lost its controlled edge. "And then they what?" "They grabbed me, Dad. They pushed me against the car. Said I was resisting even though I wasn't." The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to make Malia wonder if the call had dropped. But then her father spoke again, each word deliberate and heavy. "They put their hands on you?" "Yes." His exhale was slow and purposeful, like a man tempering fire before it consumed him. "Listen to me," he said finally, his tone now calm and measured. "Look around you. Are you safe right now?" Malia's eyes flicked to the officers. The shorter one was pacing near her car, occasionally glancing at the approaching convoy. The taller officer was trying to maintain his composure, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. "For now," she answered. "Good," her father replied. "Stay that way. Don't provoke them. Don't say anything else. I'm pulling up right now. I'll handle the rest." The line went dead, and Malia lowered the phone, her fingers tightening around it like a lifeline. The officers were watching her now, their expressions a mixture of irritation and unease. "What was that about?" the taller one demanded. Malia lifted her chin, her voice steadier than she felt. "My father's on his way." The shorter officer snorted. "Oh, great, Daddy's coming to save the day." But there was an edge to his voice now, a flicker of doubt that hadn't been there before. The taller officer crossed his arms. "I don't care who your father is. Out here, he's just another civilian." Malia didn't respond. She knew better than to argue. Instead, she kept her eyes on the SUVs, which had now come to a halt a few yards away. Their tinted windows reflected the flashing lights of the patrol car, making it impossible to see who was inside. The taller officer took a step toward her, his voice dropping to a warning tone. "If you think this changes anything, you're wrong." But before he could say another word, the door of the lead SUV opened, and Barack Obama stepped out. The former president was dressed in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened just enough to make him look relaxed but still authoritative. His face, however, was anything but relaxed. Malia had seen her father wear many expressions, joyful, contemplative, frustrated. But this was different. This was anger buried beneath layers of control, simmering just below the surface. And the officers saw it too. The taller one straightened immediately, his hand falling away from his holster as if burned. His partner stopped pacing, suddenly looking much smaller than he had moments ago. Barack's eyes found Malia first, scanning her quickly for any visible injuries before settling on her face. She saw the flicker of relief when he confirmed that she was physically unharmed, but it was brief. His gaze shifted to the officers and his expression hardened. "Good evening," he said, his voice steady and low. I'm Barack Obama, and I'd like to know why my daughter has been detained." Neither officer spoke. "I'm waiting," he added, stepping closer. The taller officer cleared his throat. "Sir, we were conducting a routine traffic stop and—" "A routine stop?" Barack cut him off, his tone sharp enough to make the officer flinch. "You searched her car, you went through her belongings, and you put your hands on her. That doesn't sound routine to me. With all due respect, sir, we—" "Respect?" Barack's voice rose slightly. "You want to talk about respect after treating my daughter like a suspect without cause? After humiliating her? After laying hands on her?" The shorter officer tried to interrupt, but Barack silenced him with a look. "My daughter called me terrified," Barack continued. "She told me what you did, how you treated her. Now you tell me, what possible justification do you have for any of this?" The taller officer shifted uncomfortably. Her behavior was suspicious. She was nervous. Suspicious because she was nervous. Barack's words cut through the air like a blade. "Let me make something clear. My daughter complied with every instruction you gave her. She offered her identification, answered your questions, and stood by while you invaded her privacy. And when she called for help, you mocked her for it." He took another step forward, his height and presence making the officers seem suddenly much smaller. "So, I'll ask again, what justification do you have for treating her this way?" The officers exchanged a look, but no answer came. Barack's jaw tightened. "Right," he said. "Then here's what's going to happen. You're going to release my daughter immediately. You're going to return her belongings in the exact condition you found them. And then you're going to give me your badge numbers, because this isn't over." The taller officer opened his mouth as if to protest, but the words never came. He nodded instead, stepping back. Malia exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding as the officers began gathering her things. Her father turned to her, his expression softening for the first time that evening. "You okay?" She nodded, but the tears she had fought so hard to hold back finally spilled over. Barack pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. "It's over," he said quietly. "You're safe now." But as Malia rested her head against his shoulder, she knew it wasn't over. Not really, because this, what had happened to her, happened to people every day. And most of them didn't have a father who could show up with a convoy to save them. The night air was thick with tension. The roar of the black SUVs that had descended upon the scene like an armored phalanx still lingered in the distance, their headlights illuminating the stretch of highway where Malia Obama stood. Though her father's steady presence had provided an anchor amid the chaos, the situation remained fraught. The officers, once so smug and commanding, now fidgeted beneath the weight of Barack Obama's gaze. Malia lingered beside her father, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if to shield herself from the lingering humiliation that clung to her like smoke. She had never seen her father like this, not in all the years she had watched him navigate the pressures of public life with grace and composure. Tonight, though, the restraint he was famous for seemed razor thin, his every word carrying the weight of barely contained fury. The taller officer shifted his stance, his hands falling stiffly to his sides, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. He had recovered some of his bravado since Barack's initial approach, but it was brittle, fragile, an act held together only by the authority of his badge. "Sir, we need you to step back," the officer said, his voice trying for firmness but landing somewhere closer to desperation. Barack didn't move. Instead, he angled his shoulders slightly, positioning himself more fully between the officers and his daughter. "Step back," he repeated, his voice calm but edged with steel. No. What you need to do is explain, right now, why you treated my daughter like a suspect instead of a citizen." "Sir," "I wasn't finished," Barack interrupted, and though he didn't raise his voice, the words carried enough weight to silence the officer instantly. For the first time since his arrival, Barack shifted his gaze to Malia. "Did they hurt you?" Malia hesitated, unsure how to answer. The bruising grip of the officer's hands on her arm still lingered, the sharp edge of his voice echoing in her ears, but there were no visible injuries, nothing that would show. And yet, the humiliation cut deeper than any mark could. "They pushed me," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "They forced me against the car." Barack's jaw tightened. He turned back to the officers. "You laid hands on my daughter," he said, each word deliberate and sharp. "And you think telling me to step back is going to make this go away?" The shorter officer, who had remained quiet until now, stepped forward, clearly trying to salvage what remained of their authority. "Sir, we followed protocol. Her behavior was—" "Her behavior?" Barack cut him off again, his voice sharper this time. "You mean being nervous when two armed men pulled her over on an empty road at dusk? Or do you mean being afraid when you decided that her name, her appearance, and the contents of her car were suspicious enough to warrant an illegal search?" The officer hesitated, but Barack pressed on. "She followed your orders. She complied with your questions. She gave you identification. And instead of letting her go, you humiliated her. You treated her like she didn't belong. You treated her like she wasn't human." Barack stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. "Tell me, officer, what exactly made her a threat to you?" The question hung in the air like smoke, suffocating. The taller officer looked to his partner, searching for support, but found none. The shorter one shifted uncomfortably, his confidence unraveling under the weight of Barack's words. Neither of them answered. "Right," Barack said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "You can't answer that, can you?" From behind him, the door of another SUV opened, and a woman in a sharp navy suit stepped out, clipboard in hand. Malia recognized her as one of her father's legal advisors, though she couldn't remember the woman's name. "Mr. Obama," the woman said, her tone brisk but respectful, "we've documented the incident. The agents are reviewing the dashcam footage now." Barack nodded but didn't take his eyes off the officers. "You'll provide your badge numbers," he said, "now." The taller officer hesitated but finally fumbled for the badge pinned to his chest. He read off the number, his voice stiff and resentful. His partner did the same, his words barely more than a mutter. Barack turned to the advisor. "Get that on record," he said. The woman nodded and stepped away to confer with another agent. Barack shifted his focus back to the officers, his voice now quieter but no less firm. "You're going to answer for this," he said, "both of you. You may think you can get away with treating people this way because it's dark and no one's watching. But I promise you, everyone's watching now." The taller officer flinched, his shoulders stiffening as if bracing for impact. Barack turned to Malia then, his expression softening, though his eyes still burned with residual anger. "Are you ready to go?" Malia nodded, but even as she moved toward the SUV, she couldn't shake the weight of what had just happened. Her belongings were still scattered across the hood of her car, her clothes spilling out of the suitcase like discarded evidence. One of the agents stepped forward, silently gathering the items and packing them neatly before handing them to her. The simple act brought a sting of tears to her eyes, not because it erased what had happened, but because it felt like someone, finally, was treating her with dignity. As they climbed into the SUV, the officers retreated to their car, though their faces remained visible through the windshield, pale and tight, their bravado long gone. The vehicle rumbled to life, and as it pulled away, Malia let herself breathe for the first time since the encounter began. But the relief was short-lived. Her father sat beside her, his gaze fixed out the window, his expression unreadable. "They're going to pay for this," he said finally. Malia didn't doubt it. But as she stared out at the empty road fading behind them, she couldn't help but wonder how many other people had been left standing there, alone and powerless, with no one coming to help. And for the first time, the anger inside her began to burn hotter than the fear. She wasn't just going to move past this. She was going to fight. The black SUV glided down the empty stretch of highway, its tinted windows sealing Malia and her father away from the world outside. But inside, the silence was heavy, pressing against her like the weight of the officer's hands had only moments earlier. Her father sat beside her, his phone balanced on his knee, his fingers drumming lightly against the screen as he waited for the next call. The agents in the front seat exchanged murmurs, speaking in clipped tones as they updated one another on the situation. Words like investigation, media, and escalation floated back to Malia's ears, but she couldn't focus on them. Her mind was still trapped on the side of the road, replaying every word, every touch, every moment when she felt powerless. Her father glanced at her, his sharp eyes softening slightly as he registered the tension in her shoulders. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice low, a contrast to the firm commands he'd issued only minutes before. Malia forced herself to meet his gaze, but the effort felt exhausting. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. "I feel—" She paused, struggling to find the words. "Exposed, angry, like this shouldn't have happened, but it did, and I don't know what to do with that." Barack nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's okay to feel that way," he said. "You don't have to have the answers right now, but you do have to decide what happens next." His words settled over her like a blanket, not comforting, but grounding. She wanted to scream, to cry, to make those officers feel as powerless as she had felt. But she also wanted to make sure no one else would ever feel that way again. The SUV slowed as they neared a checkpoint set up just outside the nearest town. Flashing lights and parked squad cars lined the road, and agents stepped out of the other SUVs to secure the perimeter. Malia's pulse quickened. This was it. The moment when her father would turn this encounter into more than just a personal confrontation. As the vehicle stopped, Barack opened the door and stepped out first. Malia followed, her feet hitting the gravel with more certainty this time. The agents flanked them as they approached the officers waiting at the checkpoint. A police captain, his uniform pressed and his expression tight, stepped forward to greet them. "Mr. President," he began, but Barack raised a hand to cut him off. "Former President," he corrected, his voice sharp but even. "And you have a serious problem on your hands." The captain nodded, his gaze flicking nervously between Barack and Malia. "I understand, sir. We've already begun a preliminary review of the incident." "No," Barack said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You don't understand. This isn't just an incident. My daughter was targeted, humiliated, and assaulted by 2 of your officers, and this doesn't end with a review. It ends with accountability." The captain swallowed hard but stood his ground. "We'll cooperate fully with the investigation," he said. "I assure you, the officers involved will be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome." "Pending?" Barack's voice hardened. No, they're done. Tonight. The captain hesitated and Barack took a step closer. Let me be clear, he said, his words deliberate. You don't get to handle this quietly. Not this time. I want those officers' badges on my desk by morning, and I want a full written report explaining exactly how this happened. And if I don't get it, I'll make sure this story is on every news channel in the country by breakfast. The captain nodded stiffly, clearly rattled. Yes, sir. Barack turned to one of his advisors who had joined them outside the SUV. Make sure this is documented, he said. Every word. The advisor nodded and stepped aside, already typing into her phone. Malia watched the exchange with a strange sense of detachment. She admired her father's ability to command a room, to bend even the most stubborn authority figures to his will. But beneath that admiration was something else, a simmering anger that had been building since the moment the officers first pulled her over. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. And what about me? Barack turned to her, his expression softening slightly. What do you mean? I mean, what happens to me? I go home and what? Pretend this never happened. Watch those officers walk away after a slap on the wrist. Her father didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her, his eyes searching her face for something she wasn't sure he would find. No, he said finally, we don't pretend this never happened. We make sure it never happens again. Malia's anger sharpened into resolve. How? She demanded. Because I want to do something. I need to do something. Barack nodded slowly. Good, he said. Then start by telling your story. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Malia opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, one of the agents returned with a tablet in hand. Mr. Obama, the agent said, you're going to want to see this. Barack took the tablet and began scrolling through the screen. Malia stepped closer, her heart pounding as she caught glimpses of headlines already appearing online. Malia Obama detained in traffic stop gone wrong. Obama family demands accountability after incident with police. Racial profiling allegations surface in California. Her stomach twisted as the words sank in. The story was already out. The world already knew. Barack handed the tablet back to the agent and turned to Malia. This is your moment, he said quietly. What you do next matters. Malia nodded, her mind racing. The officers who had humiliated her were already facing consequences. But this wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the system that allowed them to act the way they did. It was about the people who didn't have the luxury of calling their father for help. She took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders. I'll do it, she said. I'll tell the story. But not just mine. Everyone's. Barack smiled, pride flickering in his eyes despite the weight of the moment. That's my girl, he said softly. As they climbed back into the SUV, the flashing lights of the checkpoint faded into the distance. But Malia knew the fight was just beginning, and this time she wouldn't be standing in the shadows. The SUV cut through the night, its headlights carving a path down the darkened highway as the echoes of the checkpoint confrontation faded behind them. Malia sat in the back seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her, a leaden mix of relief and rage that churned in her stomach. Her father's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening as he read the incoming message. It was clear from his expression that the fallout had already begun. They're suspending the officers, he said finally, his voice even but laced with a quiet tension. Effective immediately. Malia turned toward him, her brow furrowed. "And then what?" she asked. "They get a vacation? They sit at home for a few weeks, and then it's back to business as usual?" Barack met her gaze, his expression both soft and serious. "No," he said firmly, "not this time." Malia didn't respond, but her silence carried the weight of her frustration. She knew her father was a master of measured responses, always thinking several moves ahead, but tonight she wasn't sure she had the patience for diplomacy. Her phone vibrated in her lap, and she glanced down. It was a text from one of her friends, a screenshot of an article that had already gone viral. Malia Obama targeted by police in alleged racial profiling incident. Malia swallowed hard. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the article. It recounted the confrontation in stark detail, how she had been stopped, questioned, searched, and humiliated. Her father's arrival with his security detail was described as a dramatic intervention, but the real focus of the story was on the officers and their actions. Her heart pounded as she read the comments flooding in beneath the article. This happens to Black Americans every day. The only difference is most of us don't have a former president to come rescue us. Imagine what they would have done if it weren't Malia Obama. This isn't just about her, it's about all of us. Her father must have noticed the change in her expression because he leaned closer, his voice gentle. "You don't have to read that right now," he said. "Yes, I do," she replied, her voice sharper than she intended. She didn't mean to sound ungrateful. She knew what he had done tonight, how he had protected her, shielded her from further harm. But now that the story was out, it wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been stopped, searched, and humiliated for no reason other than the color of their skin. "I need to know what people are saying," she continued, softer this time. Barack nodded, his expression unreadable. He didn't press her. Instead, he turned his attention back to his phone, firing off messages as the SUV sped toward Los Angeles. By the time they arrived at their hotel, the lobby was already buzzing with reporters. Security agents ushered them through the crowd, blocking cameras and microphones as journalists shouted questions. "Malia, how do you feel about what happened tonight?" "Mr. Obama, do you think this was a case of racial profiling? What changes are you demanding from law enforcement?" The barrage was overwhelming, but Malia kept her head down, following her father's lead as they moved quickly through the chaos. Once they were safely inside their suite, Malia sank onto the couch, exhausted. Barack stood by the window, staring out at the city below. His phone buzzed again, and he answered immediately. "This is Barack," he said, his voice low and steady. Malia couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but her father's responses told her enough. "No," he said firmly, "that's not enough." Pause. "Administrative leave isn't accountability. We need firings, investigations, and policy changes." Another pause. "I don't care how uncomfortable it makes them. It's supposed to make them uncomfortable." When he hung up, he turned to Malia, his expression softer than it had been all night. "They're opening a federal investigation," he said. "The Department of Justice is getting involved." Malia exhaled slowly. "Good," she said. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. The following morning, the story dominated the news cycle. Every major network covered it, and the footage from the officer's dash cam, released under pressure from the Obama legal team, was played on repeat. The video showed everything. The officers pulling Malia over, searching her belongings, pushing her against the car. It captured the tone of their voices, the condescension, the aggression, and it showed her father arriving, calm but firm, demanding answers and accountability. Public reaction was immediate and polarized. Supporters rallied behind Malia, using the hashtag #JusticeForMalia to call for police reform. Activists shared their own stories of racial profiling, amplifying the conversation. But there were critics too, voices accusing the Obamas of using their influence to blow the incident out of proportion. Malia scrolled through the headlines, her frustration growing with every click. "Why are they so focused on us?" she asked her father that evening. "What about the people who don't have a camera watching or someone powerful to step in?" Barack sat down beside her. "That's exactly why we're doing this," he said. "Because if we don't, nothing changes, for them or for anyone else." His words lingered with her. Over the next few days, the pressure on the local police department mounted. The 2 officers who had stopped Malia were officially fired, and the department's chief announced his resignation amid growing scrutiny. But Malia knew it wasn't enough to punish a few bad actors. She wanted systemic change, so when the invitations for interviews started pouring in, she accepted. She appeared on news programs, sat down for podcasts, and spoke at rallies. Each time, she told her story, but she also made it clear that the fight wasn't just about her. "This isn't just my story," she said during one interview. "It's the story of every person who's ever been treated like they don't belong. It's about what we're willing to accept and what we refuse to ignore." Her words resonated. Protesters marched outside the police department demanding reforms. Local officials promised to review training programs and implement new policies aimed at reducing racial bias. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was a start. And as Malia stood before a crowd of supporters during a rally in Los Angeles, the weight of what had happened began to lift, replaced by something heavier, but also steadier. Purpose. The morning light spilled across the polished floors of the hotel suite, soft and golden, but the weight in Malia Obama's chest had not lifted. She sat by the window, staring out at the skyline of Los Angeles. The city seemed alive and restless, a reflection of the emotions churning inside her. Below, reporters lingered, cameras at the ready, their presence a reminder that the story wasn't over. For days now, she had been the center of a media storm. Her name was on every news channel, her face plastered across headlines, her story dissected by pundits and commentators who saw her as either a symbol of courage or a privileged daughter exploiting her influence. She had tried to block out the noise, but even in the rare, quiet moments, the echoes lingered. Her father sat across the room, his laptop open as he reviewed the latest developments. He looked tired, more tired than she had seen him in years. Yet his focus never wavered. Every call he made, every email he sent was another step toward accountability, another brick laid in the foundation of change. Malia admired that about him, his ability to keep moving, to keep pushing, even when the weight of the world seemed unbearable. But tonight, the burden felt personal. "Dad?" Barack looked up from his screen, his eyes softening. "What's on your mind?" Malia hesitated, unsure of how to put her thoughts into words. "I'm angry," she said finally. "I'm angry, and I don't know if it's the right kind of anger. I don't know if it's going to help." Her father closed his laptop and leaned back, studying her with the kind of patience that made her feel both seen and vulnerable. "Anger isn't the problem," he said. "It's what you do with it that matters." Malia let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "I just don't want this to be about me," she said. "I don't want people to see this as another story about the Obamas. I want it to mean something bigger." Barack nodded. "Then make it bigger," he said. Use it. Don't let them define the narrative. You define it. The conviction in his voice steadied her. She had already taken the first steps. Her interviews had sparked conversations about police reform and racial profiling. Her speeches had inspired others to come forward with their own stories. The officers who had humiliated her were no longer employed, and the police department was under federal investigation. But she knew it wasn't enough. It couldn't end here. The following week, Malia boarded a flight to Washington, D.C. She sat by the window, her laptop open as she reviewed the speech she had been invited to give at a national conference on social justice. The invitation had come quickly, almost too quickly, but she hadn't hesitated to accept it. This was her chance to make her voice heard, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. When she stepped onto the stage, the crowd fell silent. She took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the edges of the podium as the lights brightened, casting a warm glow across the room. "My name is Malia Obama," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves coiling in her stomach. "And I'm here today because something happened to me. Something that should never have happened." The audience hung on her words as she recounted the events of that night. The flashing lights, the invasive searches, the humiliation of being treated as though she didn't belong. She didn't shy away from the details, letting the raw emotion of the experience fuel her words. "But this isn't just my story," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "This is the story of countless others who don't have cameras watching or powerful voices to call for help. This is about the system that allows these abuses to happen, and the culture that excuses them." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "I was lucky," she said. "I had help. I had protection. But luck shouldn't be a factor in whether or not someone is treated with dignity. Justice shouldn't depend on who your parents are or what your last name is. It should belong to everyone." Applause rippled through the room, but Malia raised her hand, quieting it. "We can't let this moment pass," she said. "We can't let it fade into another headline that's forgotten by next week. Change isn't going to come from one speech or one protest. It's going to take all of us, standing up, speaking out, and refusing to be silent." The applause returned, louder this time, and Malia stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding. Her father was waiting backstage, pride written all over his face. "That," he said, pulling her into a hug, "was exactly what people needed to hear." But Malia knew the work wasn't done. In the months that followed, she threw herself into activism. She partnered with organizations fighting for criminal justice reform, attended community meetings, and spoke at schools and universities about racial bias and inequality. She used her platform to amplify voices that were often ignored, sharing stories from people who had been targeted, mistreated, or silenced. And with each speech, each article, and each interview, the movement grew. Her father stood by her side offering guidance and support, but he also made it clear that this was her fight now. "This is your voice," he told her one evening. "Don't be afraid to use it." And she wasn't. Malia's work began to yield tangible results. Cities implemented new training programs for police officers, focusing on de-escalation and implicit bias. Independent oversight committees were established to review complaints against law enforcement. A hotline for reporting discrimination was launched, giving victims a direct line to seek help and accountability. But even as the reforms took shape, Malia knew the fight was far from over. One evening, as she and her father sat on the balcony of their home in Washington, D.C., she turned to him with a question that had been weighing on her mind. Do you think things will really change? Barack took a sip of his coffee, his gaze fixed on the city lights stretching out before them. Change is slow, he said, and it's hard, but every step forward matters. Every voice raised, every story told, it all adds up. And the fact that you're asking that question means you're part of the answer. Malia nodded, her resolve strengthening. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she was ready to walk it. Because this fight wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or powerless. And as long as people were willing to listen, she was going to make sure their voices were heard. Thank you for being with us to the end of this story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. Share this video with your friends and family. Together, we can bring attention to important topics. Check out the other videos on our channel for more thought-provoking stories.